we don't expand our imagination,
justification for being what you was.
And welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Orr. Well, this Friday brings some breaking news from Washington. The oldest Supreme Court Justice, John Paul Stevens, has announced that he will retire, as some speculated, this summer. With us now, CBS News legal correspondent Jan Crawford, a longtime Supreme Court insider. Well, you kind of called this. You said it was coming. What about the timing?
Well, I mean, that was the only thing that was surprising, that he announced it today instead of, say, next week or the following week. We've long thought he was going to step down. He's 89 years old. He served the longest on this court, almost 35 years. And he gave us a real clue last November when he confirmed that he'd hired only one law clerk. Now, that's the number of law clerks retired justices get. So, in a way, Justice Stevens told the White House everything they needed to know without ever saying a word. And that's very much true to Justice Stevens' character. I mean, he's very crafty, he's very eccentric, and so we have, yes, expected this, and the White House has expected it. They've been getting ready for this. They've got a working short list of candidates, so I think now it's kind of Katie bar the door, and let's get ready for a big confirmation hearing come summer.
It was kind of interesting the way it played out. We got word that the president, who was coming back from overseas, got word on Air Force One.
Right, from his White House counsel, called him and said that they had gotten the letter about 10:30 this morning. Stevens had that letter delivered to the White House, and that's what the justices typically like to do. If you think back, that's how Justice O'Connor kind of broke her news of her retirement, by when she delivered that letter to the White House and then to her colleagues as well. So, you know, the White House, again, I think was not surprised by this news. And the only thing that I think may have caught some people off guard was that, you know, it's a beautiful Friday here in Washington, and maybe people were thinking they'd try to sneak out a little early, but, you know, it's going to be a lot of talk about Justice Stevens today.
And a long day for you, too. Now, the best parlor game of the moment begins. So now, what's next? Who are the top contenders? What should we look for?
Well, the great thing for the Obama White House is that they've just gone through this. Remember last year when they replaced Justice Souter, who stepped down, with Sonia Sotomayor. So they cast a very wide net then. They started vetting candidates. They started doing the background research. So they already have a very good working short list of potential replacements for Justice Stevens. And I've focused really at this point on three. Two are women, both taught at the University of Chicago Law School, my alma mater. The first is Elena Kagan. She's the Solicitor General. She argues the United States position in the Supreme Court. Former Dean of Harvard Law School. Judge Diane Wood on the Chicago-based Federal Appeals Court. Once worked in the Antitrust Division. Very highly regarded Federal Appeals Court judge. And then there's Merrick Garland, a guy here on the D.C.-based Federal Appeals Court. He would probably be the easiest to confirm. He's perceived as somewhat moderate on criminal issues, but there are a lot of voices calling for a woman. You know, in this court of 9, there's only 2 women. So you're hearing a lot of voices saying we'd like to see another woman put on that court. And at the end of the day, I think it comes down to how much of a fight does this White House want. I mean, remember, they just went through that bruising, bitter fight over health care, and are they ready now to turn back to another fight over a judge?
And no matter who it is, it's not going to change the balance of power. The liberal bloc is still going to be in the minority.
That's exactly right. Justice Stevens was really the anchor, though, of that liberal wing. There are 4 liberals on this court, 5 conservatives. Conservatives still carry the day, and they will. But President Obama will get his second chance now to put his own stamp on this court, and he will preserve that seat for a liberal for another generation. So I think there's a lot of thought now inside the White House, my sources tell me, of looking at someone who could affect the court in a strategic way. His last nominee, the White House thought very politically. Sonia Sotomayor was the first Hispanic. That was looked at as a political choice, not someone who would really have a lot of impact in building coalitions and making a big difference on the court itself. This go around, though, I think they're going to look much more strategically about how the nominee and the new justice would affect the internal dynamics of the Supreme Court.
Well, taking that as kind of a paradigm, then, does that augur for one candidate over another? What's your best guess?
My best guess is the nominee is going to be the Solicitor General, Elena Kagan. She is very savvy. She's very collegial. She has a lot of support from conservatives who really like her, in the way that John Roberts had friendships and support from some liberals. She hired a lot of conservative young law professors when she was dean at Harvard Law School. Some of the Federal Appeals Court judges here that are pretty much on the solid right really like her. And she's young, dynamic, and could be seen as someone who could go in and try to build those coalitions and really be a force on the left, a prominent voice on the left, to take the big shoes of John Paul Stevens.
And fairly easily confirmed, you think, or would that be a big fight?
I think that she's probably the second. She's kind of in the middle. I think Diane Wood, again, very accomplished. She has a lot of support. She's worked very closely with some rock-solid conservative judges in Chicago, Frank Easterbrook and Richard Posner. They're very much on board for her nomination. But she's had quite a few controversial abortion decisions, and she's 60 years old, or will be. So I think Kagan's probably in the middle. If you rank them on order of controversy, it would be Garland's the easiest, the guy here with the conservative, more conservative on criminal issues, then Kagan, and then Wood. And so I'm looking maybe that it'll just settle somewhere in the middle.
Now, I know you're busy, but before you run, I know you know Justice Stevens pretty well. You talk to him at length. I mean, we know him as a public figure. He plays tennis still in an advanced stage. But what can you tell us about Justice Stevens?
Justice Stevens will really be missed on the Supreme Court because he was very well liked among his colleagues, but he's also extremely eccentric and fiercely independent. Remember, he's the one that always wore the bow ties and had the little sparkle in his eye. Right. And one of the things I think is most telling about him is that the justices, and this is kind of a strange place, the Supreme Court. They have a lot of routines and traditions, and so before they take the bench for argument, they go to a robing room where people help them put on their heavy black robes, and then they go sit on the bench. Well, Justice Stevens does that on his own. He's so independent, he can get in his own robe all by himself, and that's kind of how he's seen the law. His opinions can sometimes be hard to predict in their reasoning. He's very independent. And again, as we saw today, he did this on his own terms. He could serve another year if he wanted to, but he decided on his own now was the time for him to go, and he was going to do it today on Friday morning.
Well, he leaves a great legacy. Jan, thanks very much.
Thanks.
And she will have more, of course, tonight on the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric. Also today, American journalist Roxana Saberi made headlines last winter when she was detained in Iran and accused of espionage. Well, she's back in the States now and has documented her story in a new autobiography. Kaylee Hartung has her story.
Journalist Roxana Saberi spent a harrowing 5 months last year in an Iranian prison. She was harshly interrogated and threatened by her captors following her arrest and conviction for a crime she did not commit. Ironically, she found the strength to fight for her freedom through her fellow prisoners. Stories of their deep convictions for peace and democracy in a totalitarian land. She's written a new book, Between Two Worlds: My Life in Captivity in Iran, chronicling her journey as a reporter living in Iran, her captivity, and the struggles of those who remain voiceless. Roxana, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
So, you were born and raised in the States. I know your father is Iranian. Did you always have a desire to live and study and work in Iran?
When I was younger, not so much. I more so wanted to fit in with my friends who were not Iranian or Japanese, because my mother's Japanese. But as I grew older, I became more interested in my father's background, and I wanted to learn the Farsi language. I wanted to learn about the Iranian people and culture and history. And after I decided that I wanted to go into journalism, I wanted to be able to be a news correspondent there, because I knew the place would be full of news stories to cover for years.
So let's go back to January 2009, that first night in prison. I just can't imagine what that must have been like.
Evin prison is the most notorious prison in Iran, where many political prisoners are held. And when you hear these words in Iran, and Iranians, they know what it means, and it sends shivers up people's spines. So when I was brought there, of course I was terrified, and I had heard stories of torture and hangings and a mass execution in the 1980s. They put me in a solitary confinement cell. It was very small. If I held out my arms, I could almost touch both walls. There was one small window out of my reach near the ceiling, a sink that had water that you weren't supposed to drink, and a toilet that didn't work. I was cut off from the world. They didn't want me to tell anybody where I was, and nobody had seen me being taken from my apartment that morning by 4 intelligence agents. When I got there, I was stripped, searched. A woman guard ran her fingers through my hair, perhaps to see if I had hidden anything, and then they gave me the prison uniform. And the next morning, interrogations started all over again.
Now, the charge was espionage.
Yes.
And you were forced to plead guilty.
Yes, what they said was you have to confess to using the book that you're writing, because I was writing a book on Iranian society, as a cover for espionage for the United States. And of course it was not. And I didn't want to confess this. But when they took me to Evin prison, and I realized that nobody knew where I was, and that my captors, if they wanted, could somehow make me disappear and pretend that they knew nothing about me. I felt that I had to cooperate, as they said. They said if I confessed, they would free me. And I knew already the history of that place, that this was part of the routine in Evin prison. Political prisoners were often forced to make confessions. Oftentimes they were released after that, and then they recanted them once they were in a safe place, because these confessions have political value for their captors. You know, they like to use them as propaganda against their opponents or against critics. So I made that false confession.
And what was it that gave you the courage to eventually recant that?
Well, the moment I made it, I felt very guilty about it. And I thought, even if my body is going to be free, my conscience is forever going to remain behind bars. But over time, I was taken out of solitary confinement and put in a cell with other women, and I met several women over a few weeks. And I saw that they were very strong, and they had also been pressured to make either confessions, false confessions, or incriminating statements about themselves or others, but they wouldn't do it because they didn't want to ignore their principles and belief in truth. And when I saw their examples of strength, I was inspired, and I decided then to recant my confession. And the interesting thing is, when I did, my chief interrogator told me that he knew from the very beginning that it was false. I mean, he was basically implying that he knew I wasn't a spy from the very beginning. And I thought, why did you do this to me? And do you do this to so many other people too? You falsely accuse other people, knowing that they're innocent? And I realized that they've been playing this game with me just for weeks from the very beginning.
Because they could.
They could, and I think they had political motives. They wanted to scare Iranians who were reaching out to the West and America at a time when Mr. Obama had just become president. He was talking about engagement with Iran. Maybe they wanted to scare other journalists, other dual nationals, other researchers and writers. Maybe they didn't really want me to write this book, the book I was writing, because it involved a lot of interviews with ordinary Iranians, and they couldn't control me. You know, I didn't need a government minder or a government translator to talk to people in their own language in Iran.
So it's been about a year now since your release. I can only imagine that writing this book was therapy of sorts.
I think it was, in a lot of ways. I mean, it was difficult at times, because I would get very angry at the way my captors treated me, and especially my cellmates, two of whom are still there, and they've been there for 2 years, and they could face the death penalty. They're members of the minority Baha'i faith. And also I would get angry when I think about what's going on there today. Journalists are in jail, activists, students, the 3 American hikers have been there since July, and they haven't seen their lawyer. So I would get very angry, but at the same time it was therapeutic in a way, and I think it's helping me heal, also to talk about it and to be able to tell others that what happened to me is happening to so many other people. Even worse is happening to other people. And I was lucky that there was an international outcry for my release, and I hope that similar attention can be given to other people who are still there today.
Well, the book is Between Two Worlds, My Life and Captivity in Iran. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Roxana Saberi. And finally today, just a brief inside note. We're saying goodbye to the producer of Washington Unplugged, Michelle Levy. She's going on to some greater things, we think. We want to thank Michelle for putting us on the cyber map, and we wish her nothing but the best. That is Washington Unplugged for this Friday. I'm Bob Orr. Hope you have a great weekend.
If we don't expand our imagination,
Justification for being what you are.